Yo-ho, hello, and welcome to my review of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. A Christmas Carol was published in 1843, 6 years after Oliver Twist, and was inspired in part by a visit to a ragged school. The ragged schools were basically created to educate for free local poor people and got their names from the ragged dress of their students. The desperate conditions of the school inspired Dickens to write a pamphlet, but he later rejected the idea in favour of the carol, a project he claimed would hit like a sledgehammer. Paul Davis in A Retelling of A Christmas Carol and Robert Douglas Fairhurst in the introduction to this volume both talk about the difference between the actual novel as written by Dickens and the one in the public conscience. In truth, the cultural impact of this book, especially in England, is hard to overstate with countless reworkings of stage and screen. The word humbug is usually used quite freely by the cynical in the festive time of year, and Dickens is probably the cause of its slight change in meaning from hoax or trick to something more specific to Christmas. Scrooge himself has become a word in such common use as to earn an entry in the dictionary, and that it's fairly hard to find somebody with no knowledge at all of this story. And the story is a fairly simple one. Scrooge is, of course, a miser and a misanthrope, sending charity collectors and carol singers and nephews away with a choice insult or a swing from a sturdy rule in the early going. After he returns home, he's visited by the ghost of his former partner, Marley, who warns that he will be visited in turn by three spirits in order to save his soul from Marley's own torment, that he is damned to wander the earth forever, restlessly dragging a chain made of money boxes. The first spirit is the ghost of Christmas past, and he shows us Scrooge as a young boy, sad and alone and rejected by his strict father until he is eventually brought back into the family by his sister. We see him full of admiration for his philanthropic employer, Mr. Fezziwig, but later rejected by his fiancée, who blames his growing avarice for the split. The second ghost, of Christmas Present, shows Scrooge that despite their very different situations, both the poor Cratchits and his wealthier nephew both celebrate Christmas in the same way, with a joyous family gathering. Both families toast to Scrooge himself, one more reluctantly than the other. The final spirit, reminiscent of the Grim Reaper, shows Scrooge the future. In a passage full of dramatic irony, we follow the fortunes of a man who died alone and unloved, his belongings stolen from around his body, including the very shirt off his back. He's not missed, but instead mocked by his peers, and Scrooge asks to be shown someone who is mourning for a death. From here he is taken to the Cratchits, where the youngest son, Tiny Tim, has died and is being mourned by his family. Scrooge learns the name of the dead man long after the audience, and begs for a crumb of comfort. Instead, he wakes up in his own bed on Christmas morning in a finale that positively overflows with festive joy, and he sends the Cratchits food, and he joins his nephew's festivities, and he sets up a brighter future that honours Christmas, his fellow man, and of course saves Tiny Tim. A Christmas Carol is, of course, magnificent. Nothing with that much cultural impact could be anything else. The novel is told in 5 staves, demonstrating Dickens's love for a double meaning. The stave being, of course, verses of a poem, or the 5 lines used in musical notation, but it is also possible to stave something off, in this case, the bleak future prophesied by the ghost of Christmas future. And if Scrooge is the protagonist of the story, then the star of the show is undoubtedly Dickens's narrator. A narrator that's highly personal and generally cheerful, translating a genuine affection for the time of year as effortlessly as it juxtaposes it with Scrooge's grim demeanour and scathing attitude towards his fellow, not quite so well-to-do men. He starts off with, Marley was dead to begin with, and not quite once upon a time, though there is one of those later on as well. But Marley is as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge that there is anything particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin now as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You can see in the punctuation here that this is a novel explicitly written to be read aloud, and how strongly that personality comes across. Of all the various adaptations available, that's the one thing that they lack. And the genuine joy of Christmas overflows from the text like the great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen in the description of the Christmas market, a glorious piece of anthropomorphism, with brown-faced broad-girthed Spanish onions winking from the shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. It's a feast for all the senses, with mouth-watering grapes, that service provided free, Dickens tells us, filberts that smell of walks among the woods, those biffins again that set off the colours of the citrus fruits, and are urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. There is a serious side to all of this, the hypothesis of how there can be so much hunger when there is so much food available that it is literally spilling out into the streets. Dickens hints at this in the very next scene, where the ghost shows Scrooge the Cratchits eking out their own meagre dinner with applesauce and mashed potato, and the pudding which draws much admiration, but tellingly nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. Access to the food supply in Victorian Britain, particularly but not limited to the hungry 40s, was heavily stratified. The middle classes and above had access to this bounty, while the lower classes, people like the Cratchits, had to make the best of what they could, and there were people that had much less, of course. Dickens is at pains to show that when there's enough for everyone, it's immoral for some to go without, because A Christmas Carol is a book of dichotomies. Amongst all the Christmas cheer, passages like, "The customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left the purchase upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humour possible." And if you judge from the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that there was no one at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high. Passages like these, that really sell the spirit of the season, are arranged with contrasts made all the sharper for the hyperbole. "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." And you can almost believe it of Scrooge. While his nephew Fred is Scrooge's in-text foil, Scrooge himself is the narrator's, because the narrator functions as a very real character himself, wishing he could join in with the joyous Christmas games and lashing out at Scrooge with bitter irony when he describes his future grave, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, as a worthy resting place for him. Again, that sharp contrast with the bounding seasonal joy with its bleak, dark tone. The story here is not as important as the moral. After all, in his very first visitation, Scrooge is already beginning to reconsider his ways. But we also see into his past a life of sadness and regret, and can almost like this squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. And religion plays a huge part in the text, as it would have done in the era generally. Dickens is careful to honour that side of the festivities as well when Fred discusses Christmas with Scrooge. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. While Marley's insistence that his heavy chain was made link by link and yard by yard of my own free will foreshadows Scrooge's attempt to weasel out of his visitations. "I am a mortal," he complains, "and liable to fall," both in the literal sense, but also a reference to the fall and the concept of original sin, or in this case, Scrooge claiming fate as an excuse for his sins. The spirit of Christmas past, though, is having none of it. "Bear but a touch of my hand here," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this. Esteeming one another, and Christmas, but not just at Christmas, then, is the key to heaven." As we see with both the tale and Scrooge's goodwill, continuing on to Boxing Day, Dickens was insisting that a good Christian required tangible effort the year round. The spiritual side is also used to show us in a handful of words the good character of Tiny Tim, who behaves impeccably at church and reduces his parents to tears when he insists he was glad to go there, despite hobbling along with his little crutch, so that the other attendees could be reminded who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. And money, the corrupting influence on Scrooge that earned him so little and cost him so much, is described as a golden idol. Certainly critics have pointed to this passage and the fact that it is Scrooge's much criticised wealth that allows him to provide for the Cratchits and Tiny Tim in the finale, that Scrooge's localised efforts offer no challenge to what Andrew Smith calls the central mechanisms of power. But Dickens is proposing that the solution to poverty lays within those mechanisms. Through compassion and charity, we can help those around us. It's quite the opposite to the more modern viewpoint, which is to look to central government to sort out the problems. And really, is it any more moral to look at the central government to sort out problems that you can solve yourself? Regardless, the institutes of Dickens' time are described as places where men, through the vanity of their little brief authority, had gone against their Christian calling and barred out the good spirit. In a time where significant parts of the government were still backing the poor laws that Dickens had railed against in Oliver Twist 6 years earlier, is it any wonder that he was looking elsewhere for help? I'm going to finish up now because otherwise I'll talk about this book for longer than it actually takes to read it. The Christmas Carol in this edition is a handful under 100 pages and it fairly rips along. Its breakneck pace makes it feel like half of that, and the sheer deluge of themes and concepts makes it feel like 10 times that. To read it once is to love it, but to study the way it is constructed, the minutiae of the language used, is to see how why it takes a Herculean humbug not to be swept along with the pure joy of the narrator in the finale. The intricacies of the story, the delicate hints of foreshadowing, the meticulous repeating structure of the plot, the purity of the pathos created by crashing scenes of irreverent, unbridled enthusiasm with bleak Gothic horror, the sheer power of the metaphors, the warmth of the heart mirrored in the blazing fire, the shining light of knowledge sweeping away the darkness of ignorance and despair. But above all, its strength is that simple message that the world would be a better place if we all just look out for each other a little bit. The Christmas Carol is an absolute joy, a piece of literature as close to perfection as I'd imagined was possible. Dickens's passion for Christmas spills from the page with exclamations such as, "Oh, glorious, glorious," and "wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness," and it'd take a hard heart indeed not to join in with the final, "God bless us everyone." Merry Christmas, and subscribe for more content like this.